In today's lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that existentialist thought, as we understand it, has its roots in the ideas of Edmund Husserl and Husserl's school of thought called phenomenology. Now, I'll explain all that, but in order to do so, I have to talk a little bit more about the background out of which Husserl's thought developed, and then how that was taken over critically by our existentialist thinkers. So I need to talk about Rene Descartes and Immanuel Kant. I realize this may be review for some of you, so I'm going to go through it relatively quickly just to give you the context out of which the ideas of phenomenology and existentialism arose. So first, Descartes, 1596 to 1650, one of the key thinkers at the basis of the modern scientific enlightenment, along with Sir Isaac Newton and Leibniz and others. Descartes is a very important thinker. He was a mathematician and a geometer. If you've heard of Cartesian geometry, that's coming from the thought of Rene Descartes. And if you ask Descartes as a philosopher, what do you want? What is your goal as a thinker? And his answer would be in one word: I want certainty. Just like you might expect from a mathematician, where 2 + 3 = 5 every single time with absolute certainty. Descartes wondered, well, why couldn't more of our own thought be as certain as that? Why do we get so bogged down in opinions and mistakes and so forth? What can I know for certain? Well, if you want something, if you have a goal, you should have a plan. And Descartes had a plan. He had a strategy, and we'll call his strategy radical doubt. Now, it's not like he was a fellow that walked around, doubting whether what he saw with his eyes were really there. That wasn't it. It was a strategy. It was a methodological strategy that said, I'm going to look at all the possible sources of knowledge that we have, and I'm going to test them to see whether they could be absolutely trusted. If there's any chance, even if I have to work at it, if there's any chance that I can doubt a particular source of knowledge for the time being, I'm going to set it aside. He gave the analogy of an apple cart. You want to make sure that there's no rotten apples in your cart. You can't take them out one at a time and look at them. What you need to do is dump them all out onto the ground. Look at each one of them. Look at each apple one at a time. Put the rotten ones to the side, only put the good ones back in the basket. And in effect, that's what Descartes was trying to do with his methodological strategy. He was going to dump out all our sources of knowledge, and he's going to examine each one and only keep the ones that he felt provided him with absolute certainty. And the goal was to find anything that could be considered clear and distinct in his own mind. If he could, he would call that indubitable, unable to be doubted, and therefore it would be certain. So what could Descartes doubt? How about what people have told him or taught him over time? Well, of course you could doubt that. People disagree. People have been mistaken. You can't use hearsay as a source of absolute knowledge. Well, what about the people who take their time? They do their research, they get their footnotes, they put their arguments in order. What about that? Could he attain certainty from books? No, same problem. One well thought out, well written book will say A, and another one just as equally thought out and well argued will say not A. So the upshot is the first source of knowledge, and I would have to say it is probably for all of us, our main source of knowledge. Secondhand, what people tell us, either directly or in books. Think about what percentage of the things that you know because somebody told you. I bet it's a really high percentage. And Descartes saying, well, for the moment, let's just set that aside. I don't mean as a practical matter. I don't mean, once we're done with our philosophical tasks of the day, we should go around doubting what people tell us or teach us or what we read. He's not saying that. He's looking for something. He's looking for the foundation of certain knowledge. And for him, it can't come secondhand. Well, what about firsthand? What about what your senses tell you? What about seeing is believing? What about that? Well, he asks himself, have my senses ever deceived me? Ever? Because that's all it takes for him at this point. He wants to ask the question, is it even possible to be deceived. Because if it's possible, then I don't have certainty, and that's what I want. So have my senses ever deceived me? Well, of course they have. On a hot summer day, you look down the road, you see a puddle of water in the road. It's not a puddle of water, it's an optical illusion. Things, look smaller at a distance than they really are. You think you're looking at a friend of yours, and it turns out it's not a friend of yours. Your senses have in the past deceived you. So again, for the purposes of this discussion, Descartes said, well, can we set that aside? Yeah, okay, but what about right up close, he asked. What about right up close? Right here, right now, right what you're doing now. You're looking at a screen, you're listening to me. Is there any way you can doubt that that's really what's going on? That somehow you're not actually looking at a screen, somehow you're not actually listening to a talk on Descartes. Is there any way you could be wrong about that? And he says very cleverly, well, wait a minute, haven't I had dreams where I was at work? Seemed really real at the time. So how do I know this experience that seems really real at the moment? How do I know I'm not being deceived? How do I know I'm not dreaming now? And people have told me that there's strategies. You look at a clock or you can't die or whatever. And other people tell me I have lucid dreams. I know when I'm dreaming. That really doesn't get rid of Descartes' dream argument here, because he's not asking, have you ever known that you were dreaming? He's asking, have you ever not known that you were dreaming at the time? And I think for all of us, the answer would probably be yes. Well, okay, tricky question. But then he says, okay, all right. Let's go back to the roots here. Let's go back to the beginning. What was my motivator, my inspiration in all this from the beginning? And the answer is math, logic. Can I doubt that 2 + 3 = 5? Can I doubt a thing is either A or not A, unless I'm Hegel? Can I doubt the truths of mathematics and logic? And most of us say, you can't. I mean, you really can't. I mean, it's very hard to try to think that 2 and 3 are not 5. You could use different words for those things, but this many and this many are this many, right? It's really, there's really nothing you could do about that. But you and I might not be clever enough to find a way to doubt that, but Descartes is, he's a genius, and he figured out a way to doubt that, and it's this very famous evil demon or evil genius hypothesis. And this thought experiment, again, he's not worried that there's an actual evil demon bothering him, but it's a thought experiment. He says, imagine there was this evil demon who had 2 characteristics. One, the evil demon was all powerful, could do anything, whatever. And the second characteristic, the evil demon was all cunning, meaning you can never catch the evil demon doing his evil work. He never leaves any evidence. He never leaves a fingerprint or any DNA at the crime scene. He can do whatever he wants, and you can't catch him. He says, so how do I know right now that I'm not being totally, fully misled by such an evil demon? How do I know that? Now, what is this evil demon thing? It's a metaphor. What's it a metaphor for? Complete skepticism. Descartes says, I'm going to push skepticism even further than skeptics push it. People are like, well, I'm not really sure. Let's be absolutely unsure. If there's an evil demon who can make us think whatever, that we're humans when we're actually fish at the bottom of a pond somehow, or if you don't like evil demons, how about this one? We uncork the top of your head, we insert a bunch of electrodes, we hook those electrodes up to a computer that runs a very sophisticated program, we run the program, and you, on your operating table with your electrodes out of your brain, go, I smell apple pie, even though you're in a clean room and there's no oven anywhere nearby. Well, guess what? We can do that. We could stimulate areas of the brain to make a person feel like they're having visual or olfactory or auditory experiences. We could do that. So fast forward to a future that's not here, where we have the brain mapped much, much better than we do, and we have our computer programming much, much better than we have it now. Who's to say you couldn't recreate the totality of a reality to what we call in philosophy a brain in a vat. Not even a person, but just a brain wired up, running these experiences. You could Google that, brain in a vat, see what you find. It's kind of interesting. Or if you don't like that, how about shows like movies like The Matrix or the Truman Show, where there's somebody who lives a whole life, a whole reality, but it's still somehow an illusion or unreal. These ideas are out there, and they're out there in part because Descartes came up with this very famous now evil demon argument to push skepticism as far as he could possibly push it. The idea is, if there's an evil demon who messes with us absolutely and can never be caught, we will never know that that's what's going on. We will never have certainty, and therefore we're left with skepticism. Descartes says, yeah, but guess what? Right? There is something that remains in all of this doubting, this absolute doubting. Me. You have to say it for yourself, as you'll find out. Me. I am doubting this. I'm the one that's wondering, doubting, thinking about whether there's an evil demon or not, thinking about whether I could be certain or not. And this leads into this very famous argument. You've all heard it. I think, therefore I am. I'm thinking. What I'm thinking might be wrong. I grant that. But the fact that I'm thinking, I cannot possibly doubt. You could try it. Try to have a thought, but don't be there when you're having the thought. You can't do it. It's a trick question. So this is where this famous argument comes from. It's the result of pushing skepticism as far as you can and finding that something still remains. What is that? The I think. In Latin, the ego cogito. Whatever I'm wrong about. The one thing I can't be wrong about is the fact that so long as I'm thinking, I exist. I am. Right? So now he has a foundation. Now he's found something about which he believes he could not be wrong. But the thing that's the I, the thing that he's so certain about, is not a human being. It's not an embodied being, because that could be the evil demon just making me think I have a body when I really don't, or some computer program thinking I have a body when I really don't. I could be wrong about all that. What I know is I am this weird, invisible, immaterial something or other called a res cogitan, a thinking substance, a thinking thing. Very, very odd and abstract. He's sure that that's the one thing that is. Thinking needs nothing other than itself to be true or real in order to exist. It could exist by itself. That's the modern definition of what it takes to be a thing that can exist by itself, which needs nothing other than itself in order to exist. That's what moderns mean by substance. When a philosopher talks about substance, they're talking about what they think is really real. And if you change your definition of substance, you change your view of the world. You change your view of reality. Well, for Descartes, he's using, in his mind, a definition of substance. He's looking for something that could be by itself, that needs nothing else to be right, so to speak, in order to be, and he finds it. He finds it in thinking things. And don't say, but it's got to have a brain. Thinking can't happen without a brain. I mean, yes, you and I believe that. But where's the certainty for that coming from? Right? That could be one of these illusions brought about by this deceiver, the evil demon. Thinking then is immaterial, unextended, and Descartes says it, unnatural. Thinking substance is not part of nature. Now we'll have to figure out what he means by nature. Is there anything else that Descartes can be certain about besides the I, the ego cogito? His answer is yes. He says, every experience I have of something in the world, whether that source be like some kind of perceptual object out there, or some kind of memory or hallucination or act of imagination, doesn't matter. Whether I, for instance, see a coffee cup in front of me, remember a coffee cup, imagine a coffee cup, hallucinate a coffee cup, doesn't matter. That experience, whatever its source, if it even has a source, whatever its source of that experience, which I'm definitely having, I don't doubt that I'm having the experience, could be the evil demon giving the experience, but it could be the world, but I'm having the experience. The experience always comes in parts outside of parts, or what we call extension, or res extension, extended substance. Parts outside of parts. extension. You could try it. You could just try it for yourself. Try to picture a coffee cup of no dimensions whatsoever. Don't picture a teeny, teeny, teeny coffee cup because it has a top, a bottom, a left, and a right, or there's just no experience of a coffee cup, right? So Descartes says, well, whatever's behind it, if anything, I know first that I, as a thinking thing, exist, and I know that there is something called extension or extended stuff. Parts outside of parts, let me just be clear in this. The parts we're talking about are not parts necessarily that we could take apart and put back together again. You could see this image of a briefcase here. I just can direct your attention to the upper right or the middle left or right in this very middle. And I say, you see that part over there? Well, it's different from that part over there. And, Descartes would love that as a geometer, right? Because it means that extended stuff can be mapped. This part is in relation to that part, which is in relation to that part over there. That's this idea of extension is the root of material nature, the basis of material nature, a mappable, quantifiable material nature. It's extended. You could see that part versus that part. When you come to thought, you can't see it. You can't look at the left part of a thought or the right part of the thought. Not the thinking. You could look at the left part of the content of a thought. I'm having a thought of a briefcase now. I could send my attention over to the left side of the briefcase or up to where the handle is or down to where the feet are. But the thought itself, no. If I asked you to point to a thought, you might point to your head. You say, thought is here. No, what's there is an extended thing, your head or your brain. But we can't, as you understand, open you up, look inside, and see the thoughts floating around in there because they're invisible. They're unseeable. There's the mind, the thought, the consciousness, the soul, the spirit, and there's the extended body. And that's going to be important for the understanding of modernity and for understanding the criticisms of modernity by the existentialists. All right, so to wrap this up, extended substance is parts outside of parts. It's mappable, just what a geometer would want. It's the basis of material world. And again, it counts as substance, that which needs nothing other than itself in order to exist. Why? Because it doesn't matter what's behind the experience of, say, the coffee cup, whether it's because there's really a coffee cup there, or it's the evil demon messing with me, or I'm just remembering something. It doesn't matter. There's still the top, the bottom, the left, the right of the coffee cup. So the answer to the question, how many substances are there? How many real things are there in Descartes' view? The view that gave us modern science and technology to go along with it. The view that made us stop thinking of the moon as a divine entity and a place on a map where you could go visit and hit some golf balls, which humans have actually done on the moon. How many substances, how many real things are there? There's two. There's two. And that metaphysically is called dualism, the idea that there's just two fundamental kinds of substances, two fundamental kinds of real things, thought and extension, thought and extension. And this dualism, I should pause here and say, if Descartes stopped his meditations, that's the name of the book where he lays out this kind of argument, if he stopped his meditations right here, he would have been left with what we call solipsism, the view that there's only me, I, Rene Descartes, there's me. There's me, the thinking thing, and a nice show going on, an extended kind of show of experiences, of perceptual or imaginative or hallucinative experiences. Me in a show. How do I know there's another person? How do I know there are other minds? If minds are not something that I can experience because they're invisible, they're not natural, they're not part of nature, how would I really know that there's other minds like me and not just automatons or robots that act like I think I act, but there's nothing inside. They're zombies, so to speak. How would I know that? That's called in philosophy the problem of other minds, the problem of other minds. And it's a problem that our existentialists find absurd. It's a problem that's been worked on for centuries in the aftermath of Descartes' thought, but it's considered bizarre. And it's not the only part of Descartes, and therefore modernity's views, that's considered bizarre. by our existentialists, as we'll see. All right, so what Descartes does to prevent this from just being solipsism is he does something I don't have time to talk about really, but he has to prove the existence of another fundamental substance, another fundamental real thing, God. He has to prove God's existence. Why? He needs what I like to call a kind of cosmic insurance agent to make sure that if there's an infinite, all-good God, there would be no room left for an evil demon as he's imagined. So the gist of Descartes' view is going to be, look, if you stick to the method, right? He wrote a book called The Discourse on Method. You stick to the method where you don't take as sources of knowledge anything that's not certain as the basis, and you build back up from this foundation. It's called foundationalism. You build back up from the foundation. Your knowledge will be as certain as it's possible for us finite, frail humans to have it. Not perfect like God, but because there's a good God, he would not let us be absolutely deceived, and therefore genuine knowledge is really possible. That's the gist of his argument. There's God. God is good. God's created two further substances, mind and extension, thinking and extension, and thought is able to come to have knowledge of the extended natural world, that it's not strictly illusory. That's what he's hoping. That was his project. But that project left us with conceptual distinctions that are really a challenge. The first one we've already mentioned, the mind-body problem. That's just, we call that in philosophy, the mind-body problem. How does an invisible, immaterial, unextended, ghostly kind of mind operate a mechanistic, extended, natural, material thing like a body? How does that happen? Where does that happen? I mean, Descartes knew it was a problem. He thought, well, I got the answer. The mind or the soul connects to the body at the pineal gland. That just kicks the can down the road. Where are the hands to grab a hold of the pineal gland? Where are the hands of the mind, so to speak, to grab a hold of the pineal gland and drive around the body? Today, we even just call this problem in philosophy and cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, neurophilosophy, we just call it the hard problem. What are you working on? Working on the hard problem. What's that? Well, how does consciousness operate in an otherwise material world, a world that obeys the laws of physics? How's that happen? It's a big problem. You can write your doctoral dissertation on that if you have a mind to. Modernity gives us more of this idea of an inner person. I mean, you can read the ancient Greeks, you can read about Socrates, and you never get the sense you're reading about somebody who's, in his own mind wrestling some things. But there's this idea of an inner and outer world. The outer world is my body that's visible to all around me. The inner world is my secret world. It's my world if I care to share it with you, but I don't need to share it with you. There's always been a long-standing distinction between reason and the senses and the emotions, and the ancient Greeks knew this. They believed that reason should be the master of the passions, basically controlling the emotions. That reason should be our guide and director. But there's a fundamental difference in modernity when it comes to this kind of distinction, as we will come to see in a bit. There's a public-private distinction for the first time. And that public-private distinction is what gives us our very important political notion of rights. A lot of times when people read about Socrates, he was asked a bunch of questions, he irritated people, they put him on trial, they convicted him, they sentenced him to death. Modern people like us, we read it for the first time and we say, boy, they really violated that guy's rights, that guy's rights to free speech. There was no sense in that. Socrates was what Socrates did as a public person. Aristotle says human beings are political beings by nature. We were only what we did, our public life. But now in modernity, we think, no, what we are fundamentally is in here, our thoughts and dreams and hopes and so forth. There's a distinction, as there always has been in philosophy, between truth and opinion. But now truth has a method. Truth has a way to determine as much certainty as possible, and opinion is anything that can't be determined by that method. The method is what? Science and mathematics. Mathematical physics is the fundamental science of modernity. But things that don't lend themselves to mathematical scientific study are the things that matter a lot to us. Our opinions, religion, our aesthetic opinions, the things that matter most to us, our values. We can't prove those things because the word proof for us means proof the way a natural physical scientist would prove things, using evidence, experimentation, publicly available methods for determining which is which. Well, there is no such thing. Even when we study religion in the university, we study it as social scientists. We quantify it, like how many people practice it and what are the external practices and how do they affect the rest of cultural life and so forth. We study it from the outside. The inside of religion is unavailable to us in terms of our science and knowledge. It's really a distinction between the quantification of knowledge, looking at things quantitatively rather than qualitatively. The qualitative features are not in the realm of science. They're not in the real world, the real natural world. And a perfectly good example, a very simplistic example, this would be just the temperature in this room. Science can determine with certainty what the temperature is in this room. We just go over to the thermostat and we have a look. The qualitative feature of the temperature of this room, whether it's too hot for you or too cold for you, well, science can't determine that. Science can determine completely the contents, the chemical makeup of some vanilla ice cream, but it cannot determine whether you should or should not enjoy vanilla ice cream at all or versus some other kind of ice cream. So what happened here? What we got in modernity with this scientific mathematical rationality as the determiner of what's true with a capital T, what's knowledge with a capital K, that gave us the ability to do this, the ability to have technology and have online teaching and the ability to have computers and mass transit, mass communication, tremendous advances in medicine and understanding the body, tremendous advances, I think, advances. But there's a price. There's a price. Now in the world, because all of us, all human beings are, so many, chemical compounds and a bunch of water. Each one of us, is just a very interesting bunch of DNA. We're all equal, and we cherish that idea politically and ethically that we're equal. The qualitative things that make each of us distinct from the other, those qualitative things are nothing that can be determined scientifically. So we believe we should treat each other equally. And that's, you could say, well, that's an advance. But the question would be like, well, equally what, though, exactly? Like, what values should we have? What religious views, if any, should we have? What ethical views? What aesthetic views? In terms of what's beautiful or not, should we have? And there's no answers anymore to those shoulds. In the ancient and medieval world, plenty of answers to those shoulds. For Plato, the Forms told you what you should value. For in the what the so-called Middle Ages, the age of faith, religions told us, because God told us how we should be and what we should value. But when we start looking at things in the modern scientific way, we lack those answers. So this is a world that we live in today. This modern world, it started several centuries ago. It's a world that we live in, but it's a world that has bequeathed us a number of problems, religious, ethical, and political problems, even as it's advanced our scientific and technological prowess. The key ideas for us are subjectivity. For Descartes, philosophy starts with the ego. That's just the Latin word for I, like the Spanish word yo, the Latin word ego, the I. It starts with the I. The question is, what is the nature of that I? Descartes thought the nature of that I was an invisible, immaterial, non-natural something, a ghost that rode around in a machine. In fact, the philosopher Gilbert Ryle actually labeled Descartes' philosophy of the human person as a ghost in a machine. The existentialists are going to ask, let's look at that question again. What is the nature of that I? Is it like Descartes said, or is it something else? Also, epistemology as first philosophy. First philosophy is a term that comes from Aristotle's Metaphysics. The word metaphysics is in that book, but first philosophy is in that book. And he meant by first philosophy the philosophy of the foundational aspects of reality, the basic structure of what is. Metaphysics was first philosophy in the ancient world. With Descartes, there's a seismic shift to epistemology. The primary question is not what is there really anymore. The primary question becomes what can I know with certainty? And this turn to epistemology as first philosophy will be a target for the existentialists. They will object to that idea, as we'll see. Now, a quick word about empiricism, the sort of the epitome of the modern scientific ideal. The idea is that there's no knowledge that does not come through the senses. There's especially like no revelation or particular, insight, intuition. No, knowledge comes through the senses. If you can't see it, smell it, touch it, taste or hear it, it isn't. David Hume, Scott, important figure of the Enlightenment, really pushed this idea, and he says, look, if you look with your telescope, you can't find God. If you open up somebody and look inside, you're not going to see their soul. And weirdly, you can't even find causality. Now, the first two ideas, you can't find God, you can't find the soul. So let's stop talking about that kind of stuff. Let's pull the plug on the power play by the religious, powers that be. Let's be enlightened. Let's think for ourselves, as Kant, who we'll meet in a minute, says. Think for yourself. Dare to think. And they liked that. That was exciting news for those who bought into the Enlightenment. But what stopped them in their tracks was this last bit. Like, wait a minute, I thought we were going to get a scientific view, and science can't mean anything if it doesn't mean knowing the causes of things. I mean, that's got to be what knowledge is all about. What causes things that happen? And Hume says, well, if you think about it, we use the word all the time, but don't think there are causes. Perfectly good example is a hot day. You go outside and you're bare feet and you walk on the road surface and you feel your feet get hot. And if you weren't infected by a philosophy class, somebody says, well, how come the road is hot? You would say, well, the sun caused the road surface to get hot. But an empiricist of the strict observance here would say, wait a minute, I see the sun, I see the road, I feel it against my feet, I feel the heat, where's the cause? I'm not seeing, smelling, touching, tasting, or hearing cause. Well, you say, well, but the heat. Look, Hume lived in the 18th century. There's a lot he didn't know. What's really going on is the sun is firing off photons, trillions of photons, and they're shooting through space at 186,000 miles per second, and they're slamming into this road surface, exciting the molecules in the road surface, and that's causing energy to flow into my central nervous system, which is sending signals from my soles of my feet up into my brain. And that's what it is to feel heat. And I think Hume, if you bring him back, would say, well, that's fascinating. I mean, that's fascinating. I didn't know all that. I can see the sun. I could use a photon detector and look at the gadget to show me the photons. I can use an electron microscope to watch the agitated molecules in the road surface. I could put some sensors on your body and track the neuronal firings and put some electrodes in your brain and watch your brain light up when that happens. Where's the cause? Right? He doesn't think it changes anything. He says, look, it's no big deal. No big deal. Don't worry about it. It's fine. If you want to say, and it's perfectly normal to say the sun causes the road to get hot, it's fine. But there's just no, I don't know. For instance, Hume says, I don't think this, but maybe. I mean, it's possible, right? Every time I walk out on bare feet onto the road surface and the sun's out, maybe, what happens is God makes me feel heat. So God's the cause of my feeling of heat, not the sun. That's coincidence. You're like, I don't think that's what it is. Hey, I don't either, but it's possible. So we don't really know exactly what's going on. We'll go with our best guess because that's what science is. That's okay. I don't have the certain knowledge that Descartes wants, but I got enough to know that if the sun is out, wear shoes. right? Good advice. So empiricism leads, though, to a kind of skepticism. I know how to work my way through the world, so to speak, but I really don't know that I have what Descartes wanted, which was this kind of certainty. I don't have it anymore. Immanuel Kant. Last bit of background before we get into Husserl. Read David Hume. He said Hume awakened me from my dogmatic slumber. He threw a bucket of cold water on me as a thinker, and he really got me going on this. He said, wait a minute, I think Hume's right. If you can't see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it, it isn't. It's not. If you can't experience it, what are you even talking about? You don't even know what you're talking about. You can't experience gods and souls and whatnot. You know what you're talking about. But I also think Kant thought that while Hume was right, it was terrible news, right? Because Kant thought that human beings had within them three fundamental questions that we're all working out every day, all the time. What may we know? What ought we to do? And for what may we hope? In other words, science, what can we know? Ethics, what should we do? And religion, what can we hope? And Kant refused to think that beings that had these questions that seem so innate would not be able to get some answers to these questions. But if Hume is right, if we look out into the world and try to find the causes of things and we don't find them, what happens to science? If I look out in the world and try to find the good and I don't find it, what happens to ethics? I just see people doing stuff. How do I know whether what they're doing is right or not if I don't have access to the good? And if there's no God and no soul, how do I know what we're even doing here? So this really bothered Kant. He thought Hume was right, empiricism was right, but there's a problem. It's going to leave human beings in a real mess. He said that what we need, though, to come to the rescue of our fundamental human questions is we need a new strategy for doing philosophy. We need to do philosophy a totally different way now. Like it's never been done before. We got to do it a new way. And this is why Kant is considered a revolutionary in philosophy. The kind of philosophy he invented we'll call critical philosophy. So I just want to tell you a little bit about it. He wrote a few things. He didn't publish anything until he was 57. The guy would have never gotten tenure if he lived today. But the three most important books that he wrote were A Critique of Pure Reason, which was his book on truth, The Critique of Practical Reason, which was his book on goodness, and his Critique of Judgment, which is his book on beauty. Beauty, truth, and goodness, the three core themes of philosophy from the beginning of time. So he's a very classical philosopher in that respect. The word critique here, I think you need to know this, it's important. There's two aspects to the meaning at work in Kant. First is to show the limitations of something. So that's probably how you understood the word critique. If your lit professor says, listen, I want you to read this play and then give me your critique of it, what you're going to do is talk to me about the limitations. Certain characters weren't believable, or the setting really didn't work, and the dialogue seemed stilted or whatever. You're going to tell me the limitations of that play. The second, though, is to show the conditions of possibility of something. For something to be possible, there have to be certain antecedent conditions. So in order for me, for instance, to go see the Philadelphia Orchestra tomorrow night, one of the conditions of possibility would be what? That the orchestra is playing tomorrow night, that I can get to where the orchestra is playing tomorrow night, probably that I have a ticket, which probably means that I had a certain amount of money. If those conditions aren't met, it will not be possible for me to go to hear the orchestra tomorrow night. Well, that's what he's asking about in these books. He says, what are the conditions of possibility for there being truth? And how far can we go with what we can know, and beyond which we have to kind of be quiet? What are the conditions of possibility for making moral judgments? And you probably talked about that in your ethics course, your moral foundations course. Same thing with judgment. We make judgments that things are beautiful or sublime. What conditions have to be met for us to be able to do that? The key book, the revolutionary book, was the first one, The Critique of Pure Reason. A book so nice he wrote it twice. He wrote it in 1781 and he rewrote big sections of it in 1787. republished big sections of it. And today, if you go to the store and you buy a copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, it's going to have both editions interwoven together. Because the truth is, critics, readers of Kant aren't sure like which one of those two versions is really the right one. Now you might think, well, the second one would be the right one because the second one is his later, more mature reworking of the ideas he came out in the first edition. Other people have said, you know what, the first edition, that was really radical. And it was so radical, it kind of scared Kant a little bit. And the second edition, he pulls back. He gets a little too conservative. Well, as a philosopher, if you ever get around to reading Kant, you can make up your own mind. But I'll give you a little summary of this book. He wants to show the limits of metaphysical knowledge, being able to say what's really real, at least on some definition of metaphysical. He calls it his Copernican revolution in philosophy. I'll say something about that here. Copernicus was an astronomer. Before Copernicus, there were great astronomers like Ptolemy for one, and they worked with a view that says the Earth is stationary, it's standing still, and everything, sun included, is going around us. Why would anybody think this? Because that's exactly what it looks like. You're standing still, doesn't look like you're moving. You get up in the morning, you see the sun over there in the east, you pay attention to it throughout the day, and you see that it sets over there in the west. Next day, same thing. Everything seems to just be revolving around us, and we're stationary. But Copernicus came along and said, you know what? I know it looks like that, but it's an optical illusion. And if you change your starting presumption here, your starting position, you say, look, the sun is in the center of a solar system and we're rotating on our axis and revolving around the sun. If you look at it that way, the calculations of trying to figure out where everything is and make predictions about the heavenly bodies and so forth gets so much easier if you do it that way. So the interesting history of astronomy there. If you get a chance in life, I think you'll find it fascinating. You find some non-light polluted skies sometime. The astronomy is wonderful. But it was revolutionary. It changed how astronomy was done. And Kant thought, he knew at the time, he thought, the way I'm going to do philosophy, the strategy I have for getting answers to those questions, what can I know, what should I do, for what may I hope, my strategy is going to be like a Copernican revolution in philosophy. His view was, like in astronomy, we're now philosophically laboring under an illusion. We think the world is the way it is, whether we are experiencing it or not. It's an honest mistake because it sure looks like that, but it's not correct. Philosophers up to and including Hume, looked at the world this way. Your mind was like a lamp or a flashlight, and it shone onto the world, and it lit up the world the way the world was. And we even use this metaphor, right? People who are really smart, really understand the world, we say, wow, they're really bright. And people who have trouble understanding, we say, they're a bit dim, right? We use that metaphor of light, that the mind is like a light, and we talk about the light of reason or the natural light of reason in all these earlier philosophical and scientific books. The world is just the way it is, and we can discover it because our mind is like a light. It can light up what's there so we can see what's happening. But if we don't look, if we don't study, if we shut down our light, the world is the way it is, and that's that. And Kant says, yeah, you know what? I know it seems like that. I know it seems like, if you went in a dark cave and you couldn't see a thing and you turned on the light, there would be all kinds of stalactites and stalagmites. And if you shut off your light, it would be dark again. But you wouldn't think, oh, I made those stalactites and stalagmites disappear from existence. No, you just think they're there. They're the way they seem to be. And that's that. Kant says, Descartes is a perfectly good example of this. He thought the ego cogito would try to figure out what it could conceive clearly and distinctly, therefore be indubitable, and that would be the truth. That would be the world. So Descartes is a good example of this metaphor. And Kant says, I understand, but the metaphor of reason or intellect as a light, even though it has a long history, thousands of years of philosophers and theologians and scientists thinking like that, it's a mistake. It's as much of a mistake as it is to think that we on the earth are in the center of everything, standing still, and everything's going around us. Truth is found not in the world, but in the structure of reason itself. Reason's not like a flashlight, but like a cookie cutter, a shaper, a filter, a former. So without a lot of ado, here's the idea. Kant says there's us, the world as it appears to us. Right? Now, why does the world appear to us the way it does? Well, there's the world over there. He calls it the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself. And he says we have reason, rationality, intellect, which is like a shaper or a filter. And the world, in effect, kind of passes through this filter or this shaper, and it gets organized so that we can experience it in a certain common way amongst all of us rational beings. We experience not space and time out there in the world. We experience things temporally and spatially. Right? Try to picture that coffee cup without dimensions. We tried that. Descartes says can't do it. Try to picture the coffee cup for zero amount of time. Can't do that either. That's not having experience of it all. And then he says, what about causes? Well, Hume was right. Don't see a cause out there. But I can't not experience things as caused. I don't walk around the world looking at all the things in the world going, wow, whoa, where did that come from? I don't necessarily know where everything came from, but my reason is structured in such a way to be operating, so to speak, on the assumption that things are caused. And if I find something that seems to me really uncaused, my mind will sizzle until I say something like, well, it was a miracle or God caused. And my brain won't rest until it understands things as caused. And then finally, he says the idea of God or the soul. Again, you can't use your telescope to find God. You can't use your microscope to see the soul. But they're ideas that we can't live without. We can't live without the idea of God. Kant says we can't live without the idea of God because God is the idea that sort of pulls everything together. If I tried to figure out the cause of me, let's say I get to my parents but they have to be caused to my grandparents and blah, 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 all the way back to the beginning, whatever your story is, Adam and Eve or the Big Bang or something. But at some point, reason says something had to get this whole thing going. Now, I can't experience that something. I can't see it, smell it, touch it, taste, or hear it. But I am built to think that way, that there's a God. Same thing with the soul. The soul for Kant is about freedom in a mechanistic natural world. Freedom. We're bodies, empirically, so we should be completely determinable. But we don't experience each other like that. We experience each other as able to make choices. And so we're also able to make judgments, moral judgments about the choices and actions that people adopt. We couldn't understand ourselves without a notion of the soul. You can't cut me open and find it, take it out and put it in a jar. It's not something you experience. All of these things in the pink box that you see on the screen are ways we experience, not things we experience. We experience cars and people and dogs and trees and planets. They're the way we experience things. We are structured to experience things in a certain, not a light that has no structure. We're like this former or shaper. And even the idea of the world as it is in itself, for Kant, is an idea. It's not something we can experience. You can't say, well, what would the world be like without this structure? That's the limits of knowledge. The structure here, the intuitions, the categories, the ideas, those are the conditions of possibility of experiencing anything at all. And they also provide the limits of what you can talk about. If I can give you an analogy, if I put in front of you a deck of 52 cards and I say, let's play, your first question back to me is like, what are we going to play? And it's not the name you're looking for. What you're really looking for are the rules, right? So if we decide to play blackjack, all right, blackjack just is a certain set of rules for playing cards. You can't go over 21, right? if we were playing Texas Hold'em instead, then a bunch of cards that would be terrible in blackjack would be fantastic in Texas Hold'em. The rules make the game possible, and it puts limits on what that game can be all about. That's what Kant's revolutionary philosophy did. It showed us the conditions of possibility of experience and knowledge and put the brakes on it, limits. So for instance, no sense writing big theological books. Why? Because you're talking about something that you can't actually experience. God. So Kant says, not that you're wrong, what you're writing in theology books. Kant would say is you don't even really know what you're talking about. Knowledge can only be about things that are experienceable in this structured kind of way. Revolutionary, fantastic. The whole debate of modern philosophy after that, including Hegel, was about that structure and how that structure works, and whether that structure is the same for all people for all times, whether it's changed over time like Hegel thought, whether there were other differences. Would there be differences in these structures based on economics, race, gender, all kinds of things? That's been the big philosophical, political debate after Kant, but Kant got that debate going. He says the world is as you perceive it, as you experience it, so there's a debate over the structure of that experience because it makes it possible, but it also puts limits on things. And there's a lot to think about there, but we can't get out of this until we figure out something about the conclusions that Kant came to. He shows the conditions of possibility experience. You have to be built this way for experience to be possible. Anything you can experience has to be experienced according to that scheme, because it's just the way you're built. Describing the laws of physics, knowledge, is at the same time describing the laws of human experience. No wonder mathematics works out, because he finds math in our spatio-temporal structure. Space gives us geometry, time gives us arithmetic, one after the next after next. It's a whole long story. It's very fascinating. Causes are not experienced, but we experience what we experience as caused. God cannot be experienced, doesn't fit the scheme, but it's a necessary idea for ultimately all our experience to make some sense, to be pulled together. The noumenal world, the world as it is in itself, is not something by definition that you can experience, because you can only experience the phenomenal world, the world as it's been structured by rationality. And the immortal soul cannot be experienced, doesn't fit the scheme, but it's necessary idea to make sense of our moral life, a life that it has to include the idea of freedom. Now, that's Kant. And in the aftermath of Kant, we come to Edmund Husserl, died in 1938, in last century. He was influenced by this thinker, Franz Brentano. We're going to talk very briefly about his critique of psychologism, his rallying cry to the things themselves, his notion of intentionality, which is picked up by all the, especially the French existentialists, but all of them, what he calls the natural attitude and what's to be done about that. This idea, a Greek word epoche, it's where we get our word epic from, epoch, not like E-P-I-C, but E-P-O-C-H, a kind of a bracketing of this natural attitude to get us to the things themselves, something he refers to as the eidetic reduction, something he calls the phenomenological reduction, and this idea that things are adumbrated. They don't give themselves to us all at once, yet they still kind of hold on to a kind of unity. I look at the front of my computer. I can't see the back of my computer, but the computer presents itself in my experience as a thing that has a back to it as well. Transcendental subjectivity, that's basically what his version of what Descartes was talking about with the ego cogito, and what Kant's talking about with the structure of reason. That would be Husserl's way of describing what he thinks we human beings basically are. And the question about whether what Husserl is doing is idealism, the idea that what there is are only ideas. Okay, so he was born in Moravia, which is in the Czech Republic now. He was Jewish but converted to Lutheranism. That conversion did not help him during the Nazi period. He taught at Göttingen and Freiburg and Breisgau. He originally studied math. He was a student of this important philosopher, Franz Brentano, Brentano was one of the founders of modern psychology in certain ways, along with William James. And Brentano converted Husserl away from math and into philosophy. And what he took from Brentano was the idea of intentionality. Intentionality. It's a key idea. So let me slow down a little bit and say something about this. Intentionality, we're going to talk about, is the idea that consciousness has a focus. That every consciousness is a consciousness of something. There's no such thing as consciousness and then some kind of act of consciousness. No, consciousness is act. Right? It always has a content, always has a direction. We'll say more about that. His first book, Husserl's, was called The Philosophy of Arithmetic. And another important philosopher for you majors who might be interested in this is Gottlob Frege, one of those, turns out, he's German, but he was very important to Anglo-American analytic philosophy, and basically criticized Husserl book by saying that if Husserl is right, then math is a matter of human psychology. And that would mean if there were a different kind of psychology, there would be a different kind of math. And how can there be a different kind of math? So Husserl's philosophy of arithmetic had to be wrong. Husserl took the criticism and he revised his philosophical point of view, which doesn't always happen. A lot of times people, they have ego and they dig their heels in and they don't want to change. But Husserl said, you know what? That's right. Math and logic are not contingent. I got to think this through again. And that took him to this 2-volume, very important set of works called Logical Investigations. And that was the shift to phenomenology. Phenomenology is the study of how things show themselves. Phenomenon means how things appear, how they show themselves. And we saw that with Kant, the phenomenal world. The world of us is the world as it shows itself to us. He then revised his thought even again and wrote a book that we just call Ideas One now, is a much longer name. And that's the shift to what we call transcendental phenomenology. Logical investigations described how experience works, how things appear to us, how we experience things. Ideas started to talk about the experiencer, the one that experiences things phenomenologically. Also very important. So that leads us to some terminological distinctions, and this is another place you get your notebook out. Transcendental, and transcendence. These are what I would call kind of weasel words in philosophy. They have different meanings depending on different philosophers, how they use them. So let's talk about that a little bit. Transcendent means that which is beyond, outside, over there. So St. Augustine, we talked about him a little bit. Self-transcendent means that the thing that I am always gets over outside my boundaries and limitations somehow. And I'll say in reference to Augustine too, the idea of God as transcendent, not in this world, but beyond this world, looking out for this world, so to speak, but beyond it, transcendent. Kant means by transcendent beyond the ability to experience it. So God is transcendent not because it's an experienceable being, a supreme being outside this world. Kant says God is transcendent, meaning you can't experience it. It's beyond all possible experience. It's noumenal only. It's only an idea. It's ideational and unknowable. So when Kant calls something transcendent, he's saying you can't know anything about it. You can't experience it, and therefore you can't know anything about it, and you can't talk about it. And if you're talking about it, you don't know what you're saying. Transcendental is that which goes beyond or transcends or goes outside of itself. So for Aquinas, he uses transcendental to talk about those features of all beings that go beyond any individual being, but that don't constitute its own kind of thing. So for example, goodness. Anything that's real for Aquinas has some goodness in it. We could talk about that. Anything that's real has some truth in it. Anything that's real has some beauty in it. Anything that's real has unity in it. He says those words are equivocal. They don't mean exactly the same thing in each case, but they're transcendentals. They go beyond any individual given thing. So, a good car, a good friend, good health, good song. Good is a transcendental. It applies to all those things, but it means something different in each case. But all things have that. Kant and Husserl, though, they mean, when they say transcendental, the conditions of possibility of experience. For Kant, it refers to the structure of reason. For Husserl, it refers to the structure of experience. The structure which makes knowledge possible for Kant, which makes experience possible for Husserl. Transcendental consciousness would be consciousness that sort of make its structure built, or design is not the best word, but built, formed in such a way that it makes experience possible, but as we talked about, also limits it, possible within certain limitations. Kant's critiques lead to the discovery of this transcendental subjectivity. Transcendental phenomenology is Husserl's mature philosophy. The key themes of that are to the things themselves. Husserl, he said that theories of how things are, or how they're supposed to be, including philosophical and metaphysical or scientific theories, prejudice us in some ways when we're thinking about things. We get a bunch of categories that we use to try to talk about something, but we miss the something itself. Husserl argued that philosophy should be phenomenological. It should operate under the logic of how things are phenomenal, the phenomenon of things, the experienceable qualities of things. So he thought philosophy shouldn't be theoretical or systematic. He thought it should be descriptive. And all of our existentialists are going to agree with that philosophy has to be phenomenological. They were all phenomenologists in their own way. It's not about what should be, like theories tell you, but about what is. What is in terms of how it is experienced. And then a key theme is this, as we mentioned, intentionality. All consciousness is consciousness of something. Another word might be aboutness, a metaphor that Husserl uses, the arrow of intentionality. Consciousness like fires off an arrow directed towards an apple or a coffee cup. But there's no such thing as consciousness inactive or consciousness utterly empty. All consciousness is consciousness of something. And if you think about that, just to give you a heads up, if you think about that thought, all consciousness is conscious of something, it's going to solve a problem Descartes' philosophy handed us, which is the problem of the world, the problem of the existence of the world, the problem also of other minds. It's going to be the key to solve that otherwise unsolvable problem that Descartes left us with. How can I know that there's actually anything over there and that anything would be like me? How do we do that? And then a couple of Greek words here. This consciousness has it's two sides of a coin. Every conscious act has a noesis. That's the experiencer, the act of experiencing, and it has at the same time always a noema, or if it's more than one, noemata. And that refers to the experienced thing, the experience itself, the content of experience. You always have both parts, says Husserl. You can't have noesis that's not empty, doing anything. That's empty. It's not doing anything. And there'd be no sense of a noema without a noetic act, some experiencer experiencing the thing. Again, the existentialists are going to talk about all this. This is important too. You want to might make a note of this too, that science and philosophy sometimes operate by trying to perform what we call reductions, where one thing reduces to something else. So I'll give you a perfectly good example. The other afternoon, after a rainstorm, there was a rainbow over the house here. And I looked at the rainbow and I said, well, it's a rainbow. But really, that's not a thing in itself. A rainbow is not a thing. What we say is a rainbow is nothing but light refracted through water particles. water droplets. It's nothing but. Anytime you hear the phrase, this is nothing but that, you have a reduction going on. Somebody says the rainbow reduces to light being refracted through water droplets. It's not a thing itself. All right, so there are three reductions that Husserl tries to perform in his philosophy. The first we're going to call the eidetic reduction. It comes from the Plato's word eidos. The theory of forms is the theory of ideas. The theory of eidos, the idea. It's where we get our word idea from. What you do is you take a look at a thing and you make imaginative transformations in your mind of objects in order to find out what makes them the kind of thing that they are. All right, think about that for a second. So if I want to figure out what is it that's the idea of a coffee cup, well, I gotta try to do some things. So the one in front of me is yellow. Does it have to be yellow? Could I imagine it being red? Okay, so the color is not part of the idea of the coffee. I might have to have a color, but it doesn't have to be this or that color. So maybe a colorful thing, but not any particular color. Or does it have to be a certain height? Like could I build onto the top of the cup somehow? Well, I probably could. So it's got to be the thing that has some kind of height, but not this exact kind of height. And I just do all this in my head. I kind of think it all through. I twist it, I turn it. And when I get to the point where I say, now, this is what it takes for an object to be a coffee cup, I performed an eidetic reduction. A phenomenological reduction, also called this Greek word, the epoche, that we mentioned earlier, is about suspending judgment regarding the existence of things. So I don't worry about the coffee cup theoretically. I don't worry about where it came from or what the chemical compounds are in that thing. I just suspend all judgments about where it came from, what caused it to be there. I'm describing the experience of the coffee cup in front of me, period. That's the phenomenological reduction. That's the key to what the existentialists pick up from Husserl, and it's important, and we'll see it again and again. The third reduction is what Husserl would call the transcendental reduction. Now we focus our attention on the consciousness that sort of goes out and makes possible experience in order to recognize how meaning gets constituted. Now, think about that for a second. Meaning isn't discovered, it's constituted, it's put together. It's made. Meaning is made. And it's made, according to Husserl, and in some ways Kant would agree, it's made according to the way consciousness, or rationality for Kant, is structured and the way it operates. So it's looking back now from all the different things, the coffee cups and the computers that I've been experiencing and having performed my eidetic reduction and the phenomenological reduction. I'm just trying to describe the experience. I turn back from that to myself in a way to think about what are the conditions of possibility, transcendental, what are the conditions of possibility of having those experiences at all. I come to learn something about myself. Husserl talks about the natural attitude, and we are all at the moment walking around in the natural attitude. Not only our day-to-day presumptions of what things are and what they mean and where they come from, but even our very sophisticated scientific theories and presumptions of existence and meaning, that natural attitude needs to be bracketed out. We need to effect the epoche, the phenomenological reduction, and just put all those day-to-day presumptions and prejudices aside and get to the things themselves, what they really are, Husserl wants to say. Now, I'll end with the criticisms of Husserl, and then we'll be ready next time to talk about Martin Heidegger, a student of Husserl. Their criticism is that Husserl, he picked up from Brentano the idea of intentionality, that all consciousness is consciousness of something. But he didn't grasp the import of that insight. It doesn't get you to the things themselves. In Husserl's philosophy, it gets you to what he calls the noemata, the content of consciousness. It kind of leaves it like an idealism again. What do I know? I know my ideas. I know my noemata. I know not the world, but I know my experiences. And that kind of leaves us in that Cartesian bubble again, where it might kind of sort of end up like solipsism, where it's just me and a big show, and the existentialists will not be able to accept that. They also think that the epoche, the phenomenological reduction, is a bad idea. Now, they will all be, as I said, phenomenologists. They will try to describe human experience. They will try to do that. But the reduction is a bad idea. Bracketing the world is exactly what existentialists won't do. The one thing that distinguishes all these thinkers that say they don't want the label or they don't want to be in the same room with each other, all of them will say you got to start with the world. You have to start where you are. You don't set aside the world like a Descartes would do or like a Husserl would do. Descartes sets aside the world by doubting everything. Husserl sets aside the world by the epoche, the phenomenological reduction. Set aside the world and then I'll get to the way things really are. The existentialists say no. That's a recipe for never getting to the way things are. Things are worldly. We are worldly. Setting aside the world would just be blinding ourselves and giving up on the chances of really trying to come to an understanding of ourselves. So that's an important critique. And I'll end with a comment by Martin Heidegger, who we'll talk about next time in his book, The Basic Problems of Phenomenology. For Husserl, the phenomenological reduction is the method of leading phenomenological vision from the natural attitude, right, all those presumptions we have, of the human being whose life is involved in the world of things and persons, back to the transcendental life of consciousness, the one experiencer, and its noetic, noematic experiences, in which objects are constituted only as correlates of consciousness. Noesis, noemata. What's real, the noemata for a noetic act. That's Husserl. For us, meaning Heidegger, phenomenological reduction means leading phenomenological vision back from the apprehension of a being, whatever may be the character of that apprehension, to the understanding of the being of this being, projected upon the way it is unconcealed. What Heidegger is going to do is say, look, the one thing that Husserl and Kant and Descartes and Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and Aristotle and Plato and all the thinkers we talked about so far, the one thing they have not done is gotten to the question of being itself. They're always bothered about how it is with this or that entity, this being. I want to know, what does it mean to be at all? We've forgotten that question of being, and that's where Heidegger's philosophy takes us next. And without that philosophy, there is no existentialism as we know it.